All right. For those who are watching this on video, I'm going to go ahead and start the lecture on drawing, or at least begin kind of like an overview of the lecture, and then giving some people some time to come into the chat. First thing though, I'm going to let people know, make sure to sign in the chat. So sure to speak up into the Zoom. Lecture. And hopefully people will see that as they enter. Okay, we're going to go to share screen. Okay, I'm going to keep my little self over there in the corner. Okay, so this lecture that I'm going to do a little bit is the lecture on drawing. It's the very first art medium lecture of the art appreciation class. It is so in unit 1, the first medium that we talk about is drawing. And the second medium that we talk about in unit 2 is ceramics. Then the third is sculpture. And after that is architecture. And then I believe that brings us to week 5, where we introduce painting. Painting is actually gets covered twice. Painting is units 5 and 6. Then unit 7, we have printmaking. And then unit 8, we cover illustration for the fun of it. Although I might actually, for this time around, and then unit 9, I do cover graphic design. Okay. And I might add like an extra unit of like other disciplines that never got covered earlier. So anyway, for this first unit, we're covering drawing. And so I hope you kind of see that there's a logic to this where the the art historical content of like Paleolithic and Neolithic, how it relates to drawing. And I generally tend to kind of like explain that as we go. I hope you see how that relates to the theme of expressiveness, of making a mark, of mark making, and how that relates to the topic of lines and marks and expressiveness as design concepts. So each unit, hopefully the design concept, the art medium, the thematic content, and the art historical content all kind of work together as a group. They all support each other. Okay, so like I said, in this lecture, the very first thing we talked about is why should they be called cave paintings or why not cave drawings? They are in many ways more like drawings than they are paintings. And then we cover a number of topics. We're talking about the importance of line in drawing. Is line the most? One of the things I want you to think about is part of the point of this lecture is to get you to think about what is the definition of drawing? What makes something a drawing as opposed to being a painting or a collage? And the answer is going to be it's muddy, it's unclear. But we consider a number of different definitions. One of the definitions is that drawing is an artwork that uses primarily line. It's a pretty good definition. But there are, like some of these examples, purely tonal drawings. Another definition might be that a drawing is something that is done on paper, but printmaking is done on paper. And there are other kind of art forms that are done on paper. And then there are also types of drawings that are not done on paper. So another definition is that drawing is something that is done with dry material like chalk or charcoal or pencil. But there are other drawings that are done with wet materials. Let's see, like done with ink, brush and ink, done with pen ink, done with ballpoint pens, ink wash. So there are So the boundaries are a little bit porous, a little bit suspect. Then the lecture ends where I'm talking about contemporary drawing. And then we end the whole lecture talking about the comparison in terms of use of line weight between these two drawings, because that shows up in at least one test, multiple tests, really, I think. Okay, does anyone join us? Nope, still just me. Well, then I'm going to start officially. So, like I said, this is the lecture on drawing, and I like to begin every lecture with a page like this where I have both kind of a discussion of the overall points I'm going to make and then a breakdown of some of the points that some of the different sections. And it is kind of my manner that I don't talk through every single point. Some things get covered, but I expect you to be able to read and listen to me relatively at the same time. But of course, if you're watching this on video, you can always go back and pause. So like I said, very first point is why are we talking about drawing in this first unit? And we're talking about drawing, one, because it's so fundamental. Drawing is the starting point for so many different types of art disciplines. The starting point for learning to be an artist. Generally, go to college, the first classes you're going to take are design one and drawing one. You're going to take a full year of drawing mostly, and then you're probably going to take another year of drawing at an advanced level. Like most colleges and universities, you have at least two more drawing classes you're going to take, one of them probably being figure drawing. That's not necessarily true for graphic design programs everywhere, but for pretty much all the other disciplines. But even graphic design programs, you're going to at least take one class in drawing, probably two. So learning to draw is fundamental. And in the process of making art, whether you're a ceramicist, you're a sculptor, you're an architect, in so many disciplines, the beginning ideas often begin in drawings. It doesn't mean that there aren't ceramicists who mostly do a lot of their thinking on the wheel. There are, but even ceramicists and sculptors, they tend to keep sketchbooks. And then the other reason why we're talking about it here is because of the tie-in to cave paintings. Because my argument is they are really way more like cave drawings than they are like cave paintings. They're very unusual works of art when you think about them because they're partially carved into the walls. They're they use both kind of like materials like painting, right? And that like there are aspects that seem to be brushed on, but a lot of the painting is more like finger painting where they made kind of a wet, mushy stuff and then moved it around. But there's also a lot of like clearly drawing type marks, holding up a charcoal or a rock that makes a red Conte kind of mark and linearly drawing. So I do think they are more like drawings than paintings, but they also are there to prove the point that the boundary between drawing and painting or between drawing and numerous other media is more porous than you might think. So, like I said, one of the definitions of what is a drawing could be a drawing is a work of art that depends primarily on line. And that's a pretty good definition, but there are lots of paintings that use mostly lines, but we call them paintings. And there are lots of drawings that don't, but are more tonal. But there does seem to be something about line and line thinking that is kind of deeply tied to the act of drawing. Also on this page, I'm talking about blind contour studies. And in this lecture, I kind of cover, I'm going to get back to the previous page, don't worry. I talk about blind contour, cross contour, and gesture drawing. And so those are the three main types of drawings that you kind of need to know from this lecture and know their definitions. The reason why I talk about them is that those are three kind of like exercises or ways of thinking of drawing that every student, who is learning to draw in like a beginning level drawing class, every student goes through these sort of exercises. So doing a blind contour study, or at least some kind of continuous contour line study, where you're mostly or entirely not looking at your paper, but only looking at the thing that you're drawing. That's an experience that 90% of art students have in their first year of drawing. some point, usually very early on. And cross contour line is usually taught at various times in various levels of drawing class. And gesture drawing is taught especially at the beginning of figure drawing, but also usually at the beginning of drawing one and drawing two, that students are encouraged to learn to draw gesturally, learn to draw expressively and loosely. Okay, so I want to cover it, make sure that you're aware of why some of that stuff is covered. So like I said, on this page, we're talking about line, also talking about blind contour line studies. Once again, the basic way to do a blind contour line is to do a drawing where you can look at the thing, like let's say, look at your hand. You can look at the thing as much as you want, but you can't look at your paper. And then you have to try to imagine, like as your eye is moving around the contour of the thing, try to imagine that your charcoal or your pencil is doing the same thing on the paper. It's fun. So we also talk about line quality. And this ties in later to the lecture that is just about line. So in terms of line quality, I'm talking about one, most importantly, the change in line weight, right? In each of these drawings, you can see that the line goes from really thin in some places to really thick in others, but in quite different ways, right? Like here on the Sheila, the line is mostly very much the same, except a few tiny, really thin lines in places, and then really, really thick lines in a few places. Whereas it's much more of a fluid shifting going on like the John Byrne She-Hulk drawing. It's also a little bit more fluid on this Rico Lebrun, but the change in line weight is much more significant. But change in line weight can also be, let's see if I can also be a change in pressure, like how hard you press your pencil or your charcoal. And so the line might not get much thicker, right? It might still stay about the same thinness of line, but it might get much darker. So that's another thing to remember. And then line quality goes beyond just changes of line weight, changes of the thickness and thinness of the line, changes of the lightness and the darkness of the line, right? It goes beyond that. It also includes other qualities like lines can be really crisp and sharp versus lines can be really kind of like feathery, like where you have like a very soft edge to it, where um, lines can be um, really kind of like loose and intuitive and organic, and they can be very mechanical, all the way down to you're using like a straight edge to do as many of the straight lines as possible. Okay. Cross contour line is the idea of where when you're drawing a form, you're trying to imagine an imaginary line that wraps itself around the form. And that helps you to better understand the volume of the form. So I think this student drawing right here does a great job of kind of like explaining that process. You can really see the student really thinking through the volume of the apple. Here, Durr is doing a much more elegant solution. He's allowing the cross contour lines to kind of disappear in a lot of places and just be the light on the surface. But everywhere that he's hatching and putting in shadow, you can see that those lines are also, they're not just marks that make things darker, they're also marks that define the turn and the angle, the curvature and angle of the planes. Okay, so another definition would be the drawing should be is about line, but then what about really tonal drawing? There's a lot of drawing that is very tonal. So like this Prud'homme drawing is on toned paper and is done with white and black chalk. And this type of tone is actually made out of little tiny hatching marks. It's hard to see from this distance, but if you were to be in person in front of it, you could see that all of those light areas are made out of like little tiny, and those cross hatching marks are also falling on the surface. They are also cross contour marks. This drawing is a little bit more tonal in that a lot of the charcoal was just kind of worked into the paper and then worked back by erasing. Um, but even still, there's still a lot of mark making there. Another important thing to understand about drawing is the importance of gesture drawing. Like I said, that's the three things I want you to know about kind of like the beginning of learning to draw would be blind contours, cross contour, and gesture drawing. And learning to draw really quickly and gesturally is a really important part of learning to draw well because it forces you to learn to see the whole. If you have to draw, a still life drawing in just 5 minutes flat, and just you have to be as loose and messy as possible. It forces you to really see the whole organization of the still life and not worry too much about now I need to draw the stem of this flower. And now I need to draw this. I need to draw. You speed up. You see the whole. So another definition of drawing is that it's done monochromatically. Like all the drawings we've been looking at up to now have all been black and white, essentially. I mean, some are with a color chalk, right? But it's just that chalk on a blank piece of paper. But drawing can be a colorful, in a way, a painterly sort of medium. And so is pastel drawing or is it actually a painting? There are many artists who make pastel drawings who think of pastel as a painting medium. They think of themselves as pastel painters. But because you're holding a dry stick in your hand, putting marks on a piece of paper, I think for most normal people who are not trained in art, that seems like a crazy idea to call it painting. It's not painting, it's drawing. Um, but to the artists who do it, they say, well, I'm thinking in terms of shape and color, lights and darks. I'm breaking things down in terms of lights and dark shapes and different colors that represent those light and dark values and organization of shapes. And that's thinking like a painter. So if I'm thinking like a painter, I'm doing painting. So in terms of pastel drawing, so the first page we're looking at some by Degas. By the way, this drawing right here by Edgar Degas, the tub, is one that will show up probably on quizzes and tests along the way. But here are some more beautiful examples of a pastel drawing. I've seen this one, the leotard. I've seen that. I'm pretty sure it's the one that's at the Getty. It's a gorgeous drawing. And yeah, just a so pastel drawing can be so so beautiful. But pastel can also be really loose and expressive, like someone like Redon. Redon is one of my favorite artists. When I was an undergraduate, I was devoted to Redon. Yeah, especially my sophomore year. Here is a contemporary artist who works only in pastel drawings, and actually, I know Sheldon Tapley. I was his back when I was a young man. I was his sabbatical replacement for 1 year when he got to just make art for a year. Um, and I actually had a studio just down the hall from where Sheldon had a studio. And that was like part of the, the package from the college. And it was great to be able to talk to him, learned a lot about art making. And so we'll talk about these drawings a little bit more later. But for right now, they're just here to show that like contemporary artists do use pastels and they use them in very kind of like Sheldon Tapley uses it to really kind of create this heightened, over real kind of sense, like too crisp, too um, as a way to also to play with design. So another art medium, which is mostly a very traditional art medium, is silverpoint. That's where you're drawing. And silverpoint fits into the larger category of what we call metal point. And for a large portion of the history of drawing, metal points were a pretty common way of making a drawing. Like you had a sharpened piece of copper or a sharpened piece of silver, as in silver point, and then you would draw on a piece of paper, and then it would make this very kind of faint mark. But then, as that mark oxidized with the air over time, it would darken, and so your drawing would kind of get richer and richer over the years. Pretty interesting. And it was very favored by, especially in the Renaissance, by many artists like Da Vinci. And now it's used somewhat by some contemporary artists, primarily to kind of play with that very old-fashioned aspect of it. Brush and ink. So brush and ink counts as drawing. Like if you go to most museums and you ask to see the drawing collection, like you ask to visit the Princeton Drawing Room and you're like, you want to see works from the drawing collection, they'll pull out um, ink wash drawings. They may look like paintings, but they'll pull out ink wash drawings and be like, here are some of the drawings we have. So, um, so yeah, wet media drawings can be done with wet media. I mean, obviously they can when you really think about it. Like if you can do a drawing with a ballpoint pen, then you can do a drawing with a brush and ink as well. These are beautiful examples. I'm a huge Tiepolo fan. And actually, a number of these will show up again and again. The Seshu Toyo shows up again later when we talk about value. It might be an extra credit on a quiz or a test along the way. And then the drawing lecture kind of ends where I start talking about contemporary and well, both 20th century modern as well as contemporary kind of ways of playing with drawing. In this case, I'm both like one person here, 2015 artist, but I'm pairing him with Alexander Calder from a piece that was done back in the 20s, not our 20s, 20s of the previous century. And they're both, in a way, plays on the idea of what is a drawing. The Calder is more three-dimensional, like it works well as a two-dimensional image from this shot, but if you walk around it, the wire moves both, not just on that one plane, it moves in and out as well, so that you can see the dimensions of the forms even from angles. Whereas the Gavin Worth piece is more just straight. It's a two-dimensional drawing in many ways, but it's steel floating in midair. Earlier in this unit, I talked about Cy Twombly and Bryce Martin, and so I wanted to return to them as two artists who make paintings, but very definitely make paintings that are drawing-like and make paintings that are in dialogue with the idea of what is a painting and what is a drawing. And especially Cy Twombly, like the idea of a drawn mark is just such an important part of his process, whether he's making works on paper, whether he's making actual drawings or prints, whether he's making large scale paintings. The drawn mark is really critical to his work. Here's some more contemporary artists, especially want to talk just a little bit about the Jenny Saville here. I just find these this new body of work by her, Newish. This is 2011. Like when I was a graduate student, she was really, really hot. So that's like in the early 90s. And that first body of work was amazing. But I love these drawings with these overlapping images. And yeah, motherhood can be tough. All right. And so some more examples of drawings. I include the Richard Tuttle here in part because if they're almost anytime you're looking for an artist to come up with the most minimal way to do something or to like how to express an idea as simply as possible, Richard Tuttle is usually going to figure that out. I love this piece by Toba Kadori. I think it's a beautiful drawing. And what I like about it is the way that it really makes you very conscious of drawing as an activity, as a tradition, as a medium, but it also makes you very conscious of the work on a piece of paper. Okay, like I said, at the end of this lecture, at least we are there at the end. Has anyone? No one's joined us. At the end of this lecture, I'm going to go through these two, which I'm doing right now, and talk about the differences in terms of how they use the line, because that's going to be a question that will show up on some tests. So these drawings, one is by Rico Lebrun called See the Clown, sometimes called See the Man, because we don't exactly know what Rico Lebrun called it. And this one is drawn brush and ink. So it kind of looks like a marker drawing, but if you really examine it, you can see that these lines flow and change in width way too much. So that it needs to be a brush and ink drawing. And then this drawing by Ang, spelled Ingres. This drawing is a portrait of Niccolo Paganini, who was a um, very famous violinist and beginning of the 19th century, kind of same time period as Beethoven. And so Ang did a portrait of Paganini, and they're both line drawings, right? but they're different from each other. So let's start with one in that, yes, they are both line drawings, but there is more tone in the Paganini, right? Like it's primarily a line drawing. There are definitely passages that are just line. Most of the drawing is almost entirely line, but as we get to the head, we get more valley contrast, darker lines, but we also get more really fine hatching lines and some just pure tone where just working the drawing tonally rather than just as a linear drawing. Whereas in the Lebrun, it is purely just a line drawing. There are no tonal moments whatsoever. Two, the amount of changes of line weight. In the Paganini, there is changes of line weight, but it's much more restrained. Like the difference from the darkest line to the lightest line is not that much. Whereas in the Lebrun, the difference between the thinnest line to the thickest line is huge, right? So there's just, and then there's so much of those really thick lines as well that they really kind of dominate the drawing. So that would be a difference number two. So difference number one was, although they are both line drawings, the one of the portrait of Paganini also employs tone. Difference number two is that they're both drawings that use line and use changes of line weight, but the change of line weight in the Ang drawing, the portrait of Paganini, is much more restrained, whereas the change of line weight in the Rico Lebrun drawing is much more varied. Now, I've already hinted at difference number three. Difference number three is that the changes in line weight are actually kind of different types of changes. What I mean by that is that the lines in the portrait of Paganini, they don't change very much in terms of thinness or thickness. They mostly change in terms of value, meaning that as he presses harder with his pencil, and like these were literally drawn in graphite. This is like graphite drawing. Graphite drawing is a very recent invention. So, and at this time, it was very, very recent, like less than 100 years old. Um, and so Ang is drawing with a graphite lead of some sort, probably in a pencil, like similar to what we would use today. And so, like when you're drawing with a pencil, the harder you press to a point, the darker the mark gets, and the lighter you press, the lighter the mark makes. But and the width of the line will change somewhat, but it doesn't change a lot. Whereas the Lebrun is drawn in ink, right, with a brush, probably with a couple of different brushes, some really, really thin brushes, and then a slightly thicker mop kind of brush. And because it's drawn with ink, that means every line is equally dark. Even the thinnest line, if you zoomed in on it, the color of the blank ink is still pretty much the same ink. So the only difference is the width of the line, the difference between thin lines and thick lines. Okay, that's difference number three. Difference number four is how each of these are using lines in terms of hierarchy and emphasis. They're kind of using them almost exactly the opposite, which is in the portrait of Paganini, he zooms us into the head, right, as well as some other parts, but especially to the head and to the portrait, to the face, by increasing the valley contrast significantly. And that's, like I said, pretty much the one main place where he also uses tone, right? And so that use of tone and that use of increased valley contrast really draws our attention, makes the head feel like a really, really important, significant focus of the drawing. It's interesting to note that the other places, there are no other places in that drawing where he uses as much tone or uses as much valley contrast. But the two main things that get emphasized besides the head by a little bit less use of valley contrast and tone is the violin and Paganini's hands. And so you can kind of like literally, he's saying these are the important things, right? Most important thing is Paganini the man. Second most important thing is what Paganini can do physically with a violin and hands. If you look at the portrait by Rico Lebrun, he's kind of doing the opposite thing. He's using very, very lightweight in some places, but there's one place where he's only using lightweight marks, only using thin marks, and that's on the head. He's doing that in part because it would be very hard for him to make it kind of a you know a specific enough portrait for it to really feel like this person's a drawing without having like thin lines. So that's part of the reason. But another thing that it does is it both it kind of like makes the drawing about the two different parts. It's about the head versus the body. The body draws our attention because of all the value contrast, right? Because of all the um, because of the heavy line weight. Whereas the head draws our attention because it's the one spot where he's doing something completely different. He's really restrained. He's using very thin, short, choppy, very, very more hesitant and also more angular kind of lines. So it, like I said, it kind of like brings our, so it's a dialogue between the two areas bringing our attention. Okay, so that's, I think, difference number 4. Difference number 5 was, oh yeah, the use of cross contour lines. They both do to a degree, but certainly the Lebrun is much more big about it. It's much more obvious about it. You can like, and it's a really big important part of the drawing is this idea of the mass of this character, right? That he's a big man. He's a clown. He's a big man, and really kind of like having these wraparound lines really kind of build that volume. The use of cross contour lines in the hang drawing, the portrait of Paganini, is much more restrained. It's much smaller. Like you have to zoom in really close to see it, and in most places. But like if you got up close here to see like this shadow on that jacket, it's made up of these marks, and those marks follow that cross contour line. Okay, so I believe that that was 5. That's 5 major differences in terms of between these two drawings as to how they use line. Okay, how are we doing? All right, still no one attended, but hopefully many of you will watch this video. Okay, is there anything else I want to say? This is normally the part of the lecture where I'll say, do you have any questions? It's much more fun when people have questions. Right, and this is where we started. I didn't miss anything. No. Okay. So that is the end. And I'm going to end it here. It was just half an hour. And I will be posting that later, posting this video later today. And hopefully I will be seeing some of you tonight at the 7:30 Zoom.